In my recent video about why I want to be a witch again, I mentioned the psychological model of magic in passing, and someone in the comments asked me to explain this, so that's what I'm going to do with this video today. I found it surprisingly and frustratingly difficult to find the origins of this term, the psychological model of magic. It seems to be universally associated with 3 or 4 other models, and they are consistently the same 4 or 5 models, and they are usually brought up in the context of chaos magic and seem to have been increasingly associated with chaos magic since about the 1990s. My best guess is that it originated, or all 5 models originated with the German occultist Frater U.D, but I'm not entirely sure if it might predate him, if it might have been somebody like Peter Carroll earlier on who came up with this framework. The main 4 models always seem to come in the same order. They are the spirit model, the energetic model, the psychological model, and the informational model. And then we have this 5th meta model, which seems to be a way of describing the way that chaos magicians tend to utilize belief as a tool and to flit between these different models at different times with their workings, depending on what it is that they're wanting to do and which model is the most useful or practical for them at any one time, rather than sticking rigidly with one particular model or belief of how magic works. I'm not going to get into the other models today, and I'm not even going to really focus too much on this idea of the models and what they mean and specifically what the psychological model means within chaos magic, although I will get back to that a bit later on in the video. I will talk a little bit about chaos magic and what I see as being the primary ways in which psychology is utilised and understood within chaos magic. But I thought that it would be useful to outline those models at the beginning of the video because I personally came across this idea of the psychological model of magic through these 5 models and through specifically Kellyanne Maddox, who herself is a chaos magician. It was a video that she made many years ago. I'll link that somewhere for you to find if you're interested. The relationship between psychology and magic massively predates this particular concept of these 5 models of magic that evolved in the late 20th century. The relationship between psychology and magic and esotericism and the occult, it really goes back to the very inception of psychology as an independent discipline back in the 19th century. Our Western worldview has changed immensely, obviously over the last several hundred years, but particularly over the last century and a half or so, and that really is closely tied to psychologization of the individual, the idea of psychology pervading society, and it's linked with an increasing focus on the individual as opposed to cultural or societal focuses. And I definitely see a lot of similar threads across the evolution of esotericism and the occult into what it mostly is or predominantly is today in our alternative spiritual communities. I would say to a large degree that witchcraft and magic has perhaps always been pretty individualistic. The focus has generally tended to be on individual development, on individual gain, and whether it's towards individual enlightenment and relating to divinity or to the gods, or whether it's more towards the individual working towards practical changes in their lives. Magic always seems to be focused on individual change more than group change, even in situations where group dynamics are very important. So obviously there are a lot of traditions where group work is extremely important, such as in Wicca, or even in a tradition that is highly individualistic, highly individualized, like for example Satanism, where there's a huge focus on the individual eking out their own place in the world and selfishness as being a virtue and so on. There still is a strong emphasis, for example in LaVey's Satanic Bible, there is a strong emphasis on the importance of group magic and how that is more powerful for certain types of magic. But even within these group settings, I feel like a lot of the focus of magic, a lot of the ultimate ends of magic is towards individual betterment, individual development, and even if the individual is trying to better society or produce a better society around them, there's still a focus on them starting with the self and moving outwards rather than the other way around. And this is absolutely the idea of psychology, that we start with the individual, that we heal the individual, we focus on the individual psyche, and that in turn will help to heal society by starting with the one and working outwards from there, rather than looking at the external circumstances so much in a person's life. Obviously, through psychotherapy, you're going to be addressing the issues in your life, your interpersonal relationships and your environment and so on, but the focus is still with the individual. The focus is with how the individual is coping with their environment, rather than looking outwards at the environment and saying, well, what can we solve in the space, in the society that this person is living in? So I feel that those two approaches are very similar, and it's no surprise to me that psychology and magic have grown up alongside one another and have maybe increasingly, I haven't done enough research to say definitively whether this is an increasing tendency or not, but have become extremely intertwined. And this intertwining of the two is really seen in a lot of different magical traditions. So what does all of this mean for a psychological model of magic? What does it really mean to use psychology to understand what magic is, to understand how it functions, and to shape our magical practices? From my understanding, there seem to be three major ways that psychology and magic are interrelated with one another in esoteric writings and so on. And in this, I was hugely influenced by an article written by somebody called Christopher Plaisance. I'm going to link something down below for you. If I can't link the actual article, I will at least give you some information, his name, and a little bit of information about the article that I read. His article was specifically about Israel Regardie and Regardie's psychologization of magic, and he actually has 4 different models that are a bit more complex than the ones that I've come up with, but he was hugely inspirational for me in organizing the ways that I was seeing different people talking about psychology and magic and how I have seen them to be interrelated with each other over the years. The first of the 3 ways that I understand these two realms of thought to interrelate with one another is similar to what Christopher Plaisance described as terminological psychologization. So this is essentially where somebody is using psychological terminology to describe something that they don't actually believe is purely psychological, that they believe is happening on a plane that is outside of the mind. So what you're looking at in these instances is actually a case where somebody probably has more of maybe an energetic or spiritual model of magic, but they're utilizing psychological terminology, like this psychological taxonomy that has been developed by psychologists over the years to sometimes to add authority to their writings, or just to imply, I suppose, that at least some of what's happening in what has been described by psychology is actually this esoteric experience. There are a lot of different ways that this can be used, and when I say that people might use it to lend authority to their worldview, I don't mean that in a very skeptical sense, and I don't mean to be dismissive of that tendency. I think it's probably quite a natural way of trying to draw in people who maybe don't have an esoteric or spiritual worldview. It's a way of describing their experiences and their beliefs to people who might be more convinced by psychological language. And there also is probably a tendency with these occultists to believe that actually some of what psychology is maybe explaining away is actually something esoteric, is actually something transcendental that is happening, and that it's better described, it's better explained by something that is not purely material, it is not simply happening in the mind. So in a way, this dynamic is reducing psychology to the spiritual. It's reducing psychology to something that is not actually contained within the mind, and that is actually much bigger than psychologists probably think it is. The second type of interrelationship is, of course, the polar opposite to that, and this is similar to what Christopher Plaisance described as the reductive psychologization. So this is where esotericism, occult experiences, magic and so on is actually being reduced to something purely psychological. So in this instance, there will be esoteric, occult, magical language that is being used, but it's actually being applied to psychological ideas. So we might use the term astral plane when really what we mean is the unconscious, or not quite the unconscious, but the dream world, that place where the conscious mind and the unconscious meet. People with this understanding of the relationship between the two might describe something as magic, but believe that it is actually just occurring in the mind, that there is nothing happening outside of a psychological process that probably could be brought about through psychotherapy or through other means like that, but that they are using esoteric, sometimes esoteric words, but also esoteric practices like rituals and spells and so on to bring about a change that they believe is happening in the mind. So this particular model of magic is probably the closest to my own, and it's probably what I mostly have meant in the past when I have referred to the psychological model. I have mostly meant this understanding that when you are engaging in magical practices, esoteric and occult practices, that really what's happening is something close to what is described by psychologists. It's maybe close to even the psychotherapeutic experience, and that there is nothing hugely more that you're going to gain from those practices that you're not going to gain from other psychological tools. But I do think that calling this model reductive is very fair, and there is a lot missing, I think, in my own understanding and experience of what magic can be, and what esotericism and the occult can offer us, and that is lost in translation. It gets lost if we insist on understanding all of these practices and all of these experiences as being just psychological, as being something that is only happening in the mind and that can never transcend anything that we can experience through various different other psychological practices. The last major way that I wanted to address is probably more interesting than the reductive model, and it's definitely not as good of a description of my own understanding of magic and how it works, but it's definitely moving more towards something that makes more sense to me. I think it's moving more towards a more exciting interplay between the two fields of thought. This is the idea that magic is something that can be accessed or produced through specific psychological states. I think this is probably the most common understanding of the psychological model. I think this is what most people are going to be getting at, and what most people who engage with both magic and psychology are going to be up to somehow in their practice. There's going to be some way in which this is the case, that there is an interlinking of psychology with magic. There is a connection between how we understand the mind to work and how we have explored ideas of the unconscious, of the psyche and so on, and then drawing that in together with pre-existing ideas of magic and esotericism. From what I've read of the most prominent authors of psychological esotericism, or what people generally have understood to be the psychological model, this is their understanding. There is something like this going on. So Regardie, Frater U.D, and I would say probably all of the chaos magicians, and certainly some authors within Satanism as well, some satanic magic, certainly Anton LaVey, I would think would have some element of this going on somewhere in their understanding of how magic works. Not entirely, and there's certainly within these authors you might have certain segments of their writing that slips much more strongly into a spirit model, an energetic model, or even an informational model, especially with the chaos magicians and more contemporary occultists. But this idea of bridging the two and almost utilizing psychology, trying to use the tools that psychology offers us in order to tap into something that is beyond the mind, and this seems to be the most common. So for example, that German occultist, Frater U.D, I can't remember, he has another pen name, but I think mostly he uses Frater U.D for his writings on the occult. So he's the one who potentially came up with that five model system of magic. Potentially, like I say, I'm not totally sure if it was he who came up with that, but he has this idea of magic as something that is occurring through bridging the conscious and the unconscious mind, and through removing the censor between the conscious and the unconscious mind. But there's something more happening than just linking those two things together, right? Because like if you're just seeking to remove that censor and for the conscious mind to understand the unconscious, what you're looking at there is psychotherapy. You're looking at well, potentially either a Freudian or a Jungian understanding of the benefits of trying to link this hidden part of the mind with the conscious part of the mind, and to reveal potentially suppressed parts of the psyche. But Frater U.D's understanding is it goes a little beyond that, right? It goes, well, a lot beyond that. There is this understanding that there's something else happening, that the unconscious has powers to tap into something outside of the mind, beyond the psyche. If you can only let it do the work, if you can only allow your unconscious to do the work. And this is definitely, I think, the most common understanding of the psychological model. And it's very common as well in chaos magic and chaos magicians. There are definitely a lot of other really interesting ways that chaos magicians or chaots interact with psychological concepts. And I've really only started dipping my toes into the water of chaos magic. If you want more on that, I know that Kellyanne Maddox has done a lot of videos, and I myself, I have a book by Phil Hine, which I have read many years in the past, and I've just recently purchased Peter Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut, and I'm going to dive into them soon, and I might come back and make another video in the future if I, depending on how I get on with those. But one of the most popular or the most well-known ways in which psychology is utilised, or the idea of psychology is utilised in chaos magic, is with sigil work. So the idea with sigil work, it's a very specific understanding actually of psychology and how it can be used. The idea with sigil work is this idea of the power of the unconscious or the subconscious mind. So this is actually specifically Freudian, and it's bouncing off an idea that Freud had of repressed memories and repressed trauma being at the root of our problems. That if we have repressed trauma, this is going to result in pathologies. But chaos magicians take this again one step further. So they look at that and say, right, this means that the subconscious is potentially extremely powerful. If it can bring about problems or experiences, behaviors in our bodies, in our minds that we're not aware of, that we're not aware of the root of, then why could it not bring about changes in the material physical world? Which to my mind seems like a big leap, but I think to people who do have this understanding of magic and psychology, or magic and the unconscious to be very much linked, this is a logical step. So the idea with sigil magic then is that you distill your will into one simple symbol, and then you repress the meaning of that symbol. You get to a point where you no longer even remember what the symbol means, that you really just bury it deep, deep down into the unconscious through a combination of this suppression, this deliberate suppression, and then also this releasing of the sigil. This I can't remember the terminology now off the top of my head, but this idea that then you have to a very classic understanding of how to work magic, that you have to have there's a burst of energy, a moment when it is just fixed in your mind, when you just absolutely have this sigil in your mind, burning in your mind, and everything else disappears. So you probably will want to use some form of altered state of consciousness to bring about that moment, and then after that again you forget it, you let it be repressed. And the idea is that this produces a very strong effect in the subconscious, and that this will bring about change not only in the self but in the outside world. So I think through that explanation of sigil magic, of the chaos magic understanding of the psychological model, and this specific, like I said, this third mode of linking psychology with magic, I think you start to see what I meant earlier on in the video about how much magic and psychology have become intertwined over the decades and the centuries. Because what I've just described, it probably is extremely common across a lot of different magical traditions. This idea that it is the subconscious mind that does the work, and that we essentially have to get ourselves into a mental state where we are releasing all of the monkey mind, where we are releasing the ego, that where we're tapping into something more fundamental within ourselves. There are definitely magicians, witches, whatever, occultists out there who wouldn't buy into that understanding of what's happening, who would understand the raising of energy as being a purely if they believe in the energetic model, then this would be like a purely energy raising thing, and there's not necessarily anything psychological happening. But I still think this has become an extremely popular and common interpretation of what is happening even in Wiccan circles and various other different forms of raising energy and working magic. I think it has become very, very dominant in the magical community. An interesting byproduct of all of this is that we see a few different esoteric ideas that seem to have made their way into the popular consciousness by means of certain psychological ideas. And a lot of these psychological ideas are actually not really accepted by the psychological community, but the wider public thinks that they are psychology. So a good example is actually the unconscious or the subconscious as this very coherent part of the mind, or this strong powerhouse of the mind, this huge part of the mind that is working away, that has a personality that is consistent and is similar to the conscious mind, operating in a similar way, except that it's just unconscious, that we just aren't quite tapping into it. And this is what most people I think most people think is happening when we dream, right? That it's as simple as just pulling back the veil and just watching the unconscious go. In reality, the scientific community understands dreaming and so on to be more complicated than that. It's definitely not as simple anymore anyway, this understanding of what unconsciousness actually means and how dreaming works and things like that. It all seems to be much more complicated, essentially, than our understanding of the mind was back when psychology was in its infancy, which is no surprise, seeing as it was 150 years ago. I think that what we're probably seeing in popular understandings of the unconscious, the subconscious, is less a psychological idea of what that means, and actually much closer to the idea of the astral plane or the astral realm. And actually the religious studies scholar Wouter Hanegraaff, he's a great one actually. He's well worth checking out if you're interested in scholarly studies on the New Age and esotericism and so on. Again, I'll put all these names in the down bar. But Wouter Hanegraaff has even argued that psychology was pretty much a continuation of esotericism, that it was picking up on ideas that were pre-existing in these occult esoteric ideas and just continuing on with them in a different vein. I think that is very clear, especially, like I say, when you look at this popular consciousness idea, like this idea in the mainstream of what the unconscious means, of what dreams are and how they work and so on. So I'm definitely not saying that this is a bad thing. I mean, at the end of the day, religion, spirituality, magic, it's not supposed to be science. If it were science, it wouldn't be any of those things. And I'm a bit sick of my own spiritual practice being a bit too scientific, or scientistic, I should say, which is a whole other topic for another video maybe, but too rigid about pre-existing conceptions that we have about what is and is not true about the world, which at the end of the day is pretty arbitrary and not necessarily rooted in anything that we definitely have hard and fast answers about. I think the question of how the psyche works and what the unconscious is or is not is absolutely open for debate, and we will probably never have a definitive answer as to how the human psyche actually works. So I think basing our understanding on subjective experience, on magical experiences and so on makes sense to me. It seems just as valid to me as basing it on scientific research. I hope that this was interesting. I hope that it was of help for you in thinking about your own ideas about how psychology relates to magic and figuring out your own model of magic. I mean, that's pretty much what I'm in the process of doing, I guess, is figuring out what my own personal model of magic is. And it's not going to be anything as rigid as the psychological model or this model or that model. It's going to be a mishmash of loads of different ideas. It's worth noting as well that none of the magicians or witches or occultists that I have been reading or reading about fit into, or at least rigidly fit into, any of these three sub-models that I have been talking about. There's always a fluidity about how we understand the relationship between psychology and magic, and people will often flip between or from one model to another, even within a chapter, even within a paragraph sometimes. There's a lot of flexibility. And of course, as I mentioned before, people who utilise a psychological model will often utilise other models as well. And it's not just chaos magicians who do this, it seems to be quite commonplace. So I definitely embrace that flexibility and fluidity. It makes for interesting reading, and I think it reflects the lack of certainty that any of us have about how any of this works and just how the world works in general. So thanks for watching, and thanks for being patient again. I know it's been 3 weeks since I published my last video, but this one took a while to research and to think about, and I didn't want to push something out that wouldn't be of value to you. So if you did enjoy this video, if you got something out of it, please do like the video. It'll let me know that you want to see more videos like this in the future, and if you want to see more from me and you haven't subscribed already, then please do hit subscribe and hit the bell button so that you're notified when I post a new video. And yeah, that's it from me for this week. Like I said, do post a comment if you have any questions or suggestions for future videos, and I will talk to you again soon.